kind of successful, but then got taken down. And we talked about conditions of like emancipation of slavery and how people were emancipated, but at the same time were still enslaved because colonies didn't listen and they tried to maintain the slaves, even though they were supposedly, but they didn't practice it. They didn't practice the emancipation of enslaved people. They didn't practice them in the colonies, kept it maintained. So, very good historical nature of these things. You're in the Caribbean, Brazil. Now, I don't know, we're going on chapter 7, the nature of the Black radical tradition. So looks like we're gonna get more into it. Because what he's trying to do is he's trying to put that all into a Black radical tradition trajectory in the history of it, where it came from, where it derives from. If I'm wrong, I'm cool with that. Hope my internet's going fine. Looks good. And keep the capitalist mode of production going and the relations that it creates. But you guys get into historical materialism, I think you'll like it. So, antiquity, I see you, kind of. Oh my gosh, the time gone by fast. I have no idea who this person is. It is my will. It shall be done. It shall be. It shall be. Huh, weird. Religious? I think people don't like that I reject Abrahamic religions in their current form because of their character of alienation. All right, let's get started, everybody. Wish me luck. I will have hard times pronouncing. I usually have hard times pronouncing. I think it's part of, I just have to deal with it and figure out how to fix it. So, chapter 7, totally new chapter. The nature of the Black radical tradition. Here we go. This brings us finally to the chapter, or more accurately, to the ideological, philosophical, and epistemological natures of Black movements, whose dialectical matrix we believe was capitalist slavery and imperialism. What events have been most consistently present in this phenomenology? Which let's look up phenomenology, because I've been seeing that a lot, even within my own readings. So we're going to look that up. Phenomenology. A little bit more than that, I think, but I think you're correct. But I think there's a little bit added to it. Let's find out if it allowed me to do it. So, studies of structures of consciousness as experienced from first-person point of view aim to understand the living experience of human beings. Close, huh? All right. Which social processes has it persistently reiterated? These are all questions. From which social processes is it demonstrably that is historically alienated? How does it relate to the political order? Which graphic constructs the semantic codes was it most often exhibited? Where have its metaphysical boundaries been most certainly fixed? What are the epistemological systems? These are the questions that we now must address, relieved from paradigmatic and categorical imperatives that have so long plagued Western scholarship and whose insistence stemmed largely from their uncritical application and the unquestioned presumption that regardless of their historical origins, they were universal. Having arrived at a historical moment, at the conjuncture, at the auspicious time, where the varieties of intellectuals and analytical imitation are no longer as significant to the black ideologue as they once were, where the now current but dominant traditions of Western thought have once again been revealed to have a casual rather than systemic or organic relationships to the myriad transformation of human development in history. When this is the central issue, the most formidable apparatus of physical domination and control have disintegrated in the face of the most unlikely opposition. India, Algeria, Angola, Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau, Iran, Mozambique. The total configuration of human experiences requires other forms. Our first step is relatively easy because it was always there, always indicated in the histories of the radical tradition, again and again in the reports, casual memoirs, official accounts, eyewitness observation, and histories of each of the traditions, episodes for the 16th century to the even recounted in last week's or last month's journal. One note has occurred and reoccurred: the absence of mass violence. Western observers often concede in their amazement, having repeatedly remarked that in the vast series of encounters between black people and other oppressors, only some of which have been recounted above, black people have seldom employed the level of violence that they, the Westerners, understood the situation required. When we recall that in the New World of the 19th century, the approximately 60 whites killed in the Nat Turner insurrection was one of the largest totals of that century, when we recall that in the massive uprising, of slaves in 1831 in Jamaica, where 300 slaves lived under the domination of 30,000 whites. I said 300,000. Okay. Whites, only 14 white casualties were reported. When in revolt after revolt, we compare the massive of often undiscriminate reprisal of the civilized master class, the employment of terror, to the scale of violence to the slaves, at present, their decadence. At least one impression is, thank you, at least one impression is that a very different and shared order of things existed among these brutally violated people. Why did Nat Turner, admittedly a violent man, spare no whites? Why did Toussaint escort his absent master's family to safety before joining the slave revolution? Why was no white person killed in a slave rebellion in colonial Virginia? Why would Edmund Morgan and Gerald Mullen argue that slave brutality was directly related to acculturation? Quote, that the more slaves came to resemble the indignant freemen whom they displaced, the more dangerous they became. Every century, it was the same. The people with Chilimbawami in 1915 forced march European women and children to the safety of colonialist settlement. And in that tradition, in the 1930s, James ambivalently found Dessalines wanting for his transgression of the tradition. Dessalines was a military genius, yes. He was shrewd, cunning, but he was also a man whose hatred had to be kept in check, quote unquote. There was violence, of course, but in this tradition, is it most often was turned inward, the active against the passive, or as was the case of the, oh my gosh, the quasi in 1856, the community against its material aspects. This is not savagery, quote unquote, as the gentlemen soldiers of the 19th and 20th century European armies arrogantly reported to their beloved publics at home. Neither was it the fratricide of Fanon's extended Freudianism. It's like Freudianism. And only seldom was it the endeavoring revolutionary terror. Now, to be honest, I think Fanon critiqued Freud a lot. And of the international bourgeoisie democratic revolution, the Genovese neo-Marxism has led him to knowledge. This violence was not inspired by the external object. It was not understood as a part of an attack on a system or an engagement with the abstraction of oppressive structures and relations. Rather, it was their Jonestown, or non-quasi, the renunification of actual being for historical beings, the preservation of the ontological totality granted by a metaphysical system that had never allowed for property in either the physical, philosophical, temporal, legal, social, or psychic senses. For them, defeat or victory was the internal affair, like those in the 1950s who took to the mountains and forests of Kenya to become the land and freedom army. The material or objective power of the enemy was irrelevant to their destinies. His machines, which flung metal missiles, his vessels of smoke, gas, fire, disease, all were the lesser relevance than the integral totality of the people themselves. This as what Chiliam Benwawi meant when he entreated his people to, quote, strike a blow and die, end quote. This is what all the Jacobos in all of the thousands of, oh my gosh, here we go, the Chashawashiwaza, sorry everybody, and at all the tens of thousands of beer parties that dot the black world have been saying for tens of generations. Quote, we had only ourselves to blame for the defeat, end quote. This was a revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of black people, and not merely from the social formation of capitalist slavery or the relations of production of colonialism. It becomes clear then that for the period between the mid-16th and mid-19th centuries, it was an African tradition that grounded collective resistance of black people to slavery and colonial imperialism. This is precisely what Gerald Mullen discovered and wrote about in his study of black people in 18th century Virginia. There he concluded, whatever the prices, meaning of the procurement for the African as a person, his fellowship or affectivity, a core area of human behavior, remained intact as a slave. Africans assumed that resistance was a group activity, ran off with their own countrymen, and American-born slaves included biracial peoples. They use the M-word, everybody. Every time I say biracial peoples, they're using the M-word. Further on, he would make the point again, only differently and more to our immediate point. The outlandish, quote-unquote, Africans often reacted to their new conditions by attempting to escape, either to return to Africa or to form settlements of fugitives to recreate their old life in the new land. These activities were not predicated upon the Africans' experience of plantation life, but on a total rejection of their lot, end quote. Such was the stuff from which legends were made among the Africans, where to deny to oneself the eating of salt, the quote-unquote ocean sea, was a guarantee of the retention of the power to fly, really fly home. All of it was a part of a tradition that was considerably different from what was made of the individualistic and often spontaneous motives that energize the runaway and arsonists, the prisoner. It more easily sustained suicide than assault, and its ideological, social, is it psychology? Wait, psycho, psychosocial, yeah, culture, and historical occurrences were more charismatic than political. When its actualization was frustrated, it became obey, voodoo, Maoism, Pokama, Kopanamania, which I think are all religions. The religious of the oppressed, as Vittorio Latiniera put it. When it was realized it could become the Palmares, the Bush black person settlements, and at its height, Haiti. But always its focus was on the structures of the mind. Its epistemological granted supremacy to metaphysics, not the material. It was the mind metaphysicals, ideology consciousness that was Mackendel's tool in the mid 18th century, Haiti. He persuaded black people and their masters to sense a hatred of the slaves in palpable terms. Ordinary precautions, were irrelevant. What the slaves could be physically obstructed from accomplishing was unimportant. Their hatred was a material force, capable of snuffing the lives from masters who had gone so far as to import their food from France and had unloaded their precious cargo of their own hands, with their own hands. It was the same with Hyacinth. His army could rush the cannon of the French forces, quote, without fear or care for the volleys, end quote. Shoving their arms into the cannons, we read this in Black Jacob's mouths. They believed that, quote, if they were killed, they would wake up again in Africa, end quote. Oh gosh. On that final day of March 1792, 2,000 of them died to a mere 100 of their opponents. But they were doubly blessed. They won the battle and even their dead were free. Bookmen possessed the same truth. And so did Romaine, Nanny, who had preceded her Haitian sister by 60 years, was warmed in her mountainous retreat in Jamaica. But that very same consciousness, they lived on their terms. They died on their terms. They obtained their freedom on their terms. Thus, it was the Obohuemen and the women, the Obahawen and the Obahawomen. I'm saying it incorrectly. And the Papaloi. These were the terms that these African peasants and farmers had brought with them to their capacity. They were also the only terms in which their, captivity, thank you, got it. They were also the only term in which their freedom could be acquired. At Richmond, Virginia, in the summer of 1800, Gabriel had not quite realized this vision, but his George Smith did. Smith believed in Africa and knew of the, quote, outlandish people, end quote, that they dealt with witches and wizards, and thus would be useful in armies to tell when the calamity was about to befall on them, end quote. In 1822, in Charleston, South Carolina, Denmark Vesey realized it, but was Galen Jack knew it too little. And in 1830, old Nat brought it to fruition. This is Nat Turner. Only Nat Turner, who charged his plan with supernatural signs and sacred, sacred? Yeah, sacred, poetic language that inspired action was able to transcend the world of the plantation and the city. Only Turner led a, quote, sustained insurrection. It could not be otherwise. This is what the black radical traditions made manifest. It was the consciousness implicated in what Amos Tutula, so many generations later, would name, quote, the bush of the ghost, end quote. In the 20th century, when black radical thinkers had acquired new habits of thought in keeping, some of them supposed, with the new conditions of their people, their task eventually became the revelation of the older tradition. Not surprisingly, they would discover it first in their history and finally all around them. The black radical tradition that they were to rediscover from a black historical experience, nearly grounded under the intellectual weight of authority of the official European version of the past, was to be the foundation upon which they stood. From this vantage point, they could survey the theoretical, ideological, and political instrumentation with which Western radicalism approached the problem of revolutionary social change. The black radical tradition cast doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life, and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience, stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture. It gave them cause to question the authority of the radical intelligentsia, drawn by its own analyses from marginal and ambiguous social strata to construct the adequate manifestation of proletarian power. And it drew them more and more towards the actual discourse of revolutionary masses, the impulse to make history in their own terms. And finally, the black radical tradition forced them to reevaluate the nature of historical roles of ideology and consciousness. After all, it had been as an emergent African people and not as slaves that black men and women had opposed enslavement. And long before the advent of the madmen and specialists, as Wole Soyinka phrases it, the military dictators of neo-colonial petty bourgeoisie, who in our own time have come to dominate black societies in Africa and in the Caribbean. The black radical tradition had defined the terms of their deconstruction, the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. Sorry. Any questions before we go to part 3, black radicalism and Marxist theory? Any questions? No, I am not. I am not Cuban. Huh? All right. Chapter 8. That was a quick chapter. Holy fuck. This is part 3. Part 3, right? Chapter 8. The formation of an intelligentsia. Pan-Africanist. I do agree with Pan-Africanist, but I am a white person. And I do believe in the black radical tradition, even as a Marxist. I still believe to bring those two worlds together. So it's important for us, decolonial Marxists, especially as in the Maoist formation, or the region where I'm at, to understand the black radical tradition, because where the region I'm at is important, especially. Chapter 8, the formation of an intelligentsia. It is not surprising that the appearance of the world revolutionary black intelligentsia in the 20th century, rather than the issue of a longer process, might be presumed by most observers to be a phenomenon unique and specific to this century. Several quite easily identified reasons have contributed to this presumption. For one, as we have seen, the history of black peoples has been recast constantly in both naive and perverse ways. Most particularly, the memory of black rebelliousness to slavery and other forms of oppression was systematically distorted and suppressed in the service of radicalism. No, that's racialists. Sorry. Eurocentric and ruling class historiographies. The sum total was the dehumanization of black people. The native responsiveness of the species was denied to African peoples. This distortion might have been simpler matter if it had been merely a question of a gap occurring in the record. But the space had been filled with nonsense that was made credible by the convictions of racist thinking. For an unaware, nothing was amiss. It was this tangle to which the preceding chapters were addressed, and an attempt made towards the achievement of a greater consciousness of the past of African peoples. A second basis for the misapprehensions of the grounds upon which black revolutionists had developed, however, was a different set of convictions. In Western historiography, certain habits respecting the framing of events, especially among scholars and ideologues accustomed to assuming the existence of qualitatively distinct stages of human development, tended to trivialize or diminish the significance of precedents of two long-standing accounts. Enmeshed as they were in historical tradition, boasting of, say, Elizabethan and Edwardian eras, or Jeffersonian or Jacksonian structures, and so on, rather singular and often superficial benchmarks had become the rule for establishing the setting of human activity. Divisions of historical time seems particularly easy things to recognize, attribute, distribute, and declare. To such intellects, then, the 20th century would seem to text it in its own right. In a moment we shall investigate how poor a preparation this would be for a proper placement of black revolutionary thinking. Finally, of course, there was the empowering spectacle of European radicalism and revolution apparently launched by the First World War. No matter their ideological and theoretical legacy, liberal or otherwise, it seemed to some that these events were bound to the immediate forces that overtook the older capitalist order in the 20th century. Moreover, the names of the 20th century revolutionists, Zapata, Lenin, Trotsky, Gandhi, Mao, Fidel, Lumumba, Ho Chi Minh, Cabral, and many others, represented the same time more than Marx and Engels had anticipated in the 19th century, and much less. In any case, it was eminently obvious that to them the black revolutionary thought found its beginning here. There was little cause to look elsewhere. In 1966, Eugene Genovese, the radical historian, neatly asserted all three propositions in an attack on the idea of a black radical tradition in America. American, sure, no, they're not white. Yeah, they're not white. They're a person of color. I think he's questioning what the book said. I think they're questioning what the book said. Okay. They're not been done anything wrong yet, I don't think. American radicals have long been imprisoned by the pernicious notion that the masses are necessarily both good and revolutionary. This viewpoint now dominates the Black liberation movement, which has been fed for decades by right radical historians who, in this one respect, have set the ideological pace for their liberal colleagues. It was becoming virtually sacrilege, or at least white chauvinism, to suggest that slavery was a social system within which whites and black people lived in harmony as well as antagonism. That there is little evidence of massive organized opposition to the regime, that black people did not establish a revolutionary tradition of much significance, and that our main problem is to discover the reason for the widespread accommodations, and perhaps more important, the long-term effects both of the accommodations and of that resistance which did occur. This opposition to slavery was minimal in, quote, the absence of extreme weaknesses in such a tradition. Black nationalism as a movement was a 20th century phenomenon, and the regard accorded to the revolutionary politics of the black masses was its source of, quote, white radicalism. In the present chapter, we will explore in detail this final thesis, the presumed relationship between black radicalism and European radical movements. It is by far the more important of the three propositions associated with the misconception of black radicalism. Nevertheless, some attention to the habits of historical construction is warranted. It will prove a useful preliminary step, I believe, in our effort to recognize the continuity that exists between black rebellions of the previous centuries and the first articulation of a world revolutionary black theory in the present century. Any questions before I move? Sure. It's from the internalness, but the externalness is an element, but the internal contradiction is everything is the things inside itself. So because of on contradiction as a Maoist, that adds to that scenario with on contradiction that everything's internal is primary and things that are external are secondary. But the externalness still has pressure on the internalness. Does that make sense? It says it all over on contradiction. I said that the external is not primary, secondary. It still has influences on it. I get it, but that's why we have on contradiction. It's an added to the dialectics. And on contradiction, as Mao says, that internal contradictions are primary, the external contradictions are secondary. It's in on. I'll read it to you if you want me to. Well, well, that's why that's why Mao adds to the dialectics. Dialectics is a perpetual motion. As a Maoist, we believe in on contradiction. That's our position. Okay. Capitalism, imperialism, and the black middle classes. In chapter 6, because we were rehearsing events that assumed their shape not less than 100 years or so ago, our historical narrative worked with the Western convention of centuries and terms as terms of periodization as a convenient scaffold. However, social process, that is historical developments, are neither or the products of more meaningful framed by such evenly measured Periodicities, period, period, periodicities. Huh. Let's see what that word says. Right back. Periodicities. Do you know what that means? Just kidding. Gotta add it. So periodicities, they're occurring, regular, or predictable pattern of physics and chemical properties over time and space. That's what I got. The French historian Ferdinand Brundel, for one important instance, made this point by extending the 16th century, the historical movements of the dawning of the modern capitalist world in the West, much beyond its formal claim of 100 years. In a different manner, the Russian revolutionary Leonid Trotsky was as opposite. No, it's not opposite. Apposite. That's not opposite. That's apposite. What does it say? What'd you say it was? Oh. All right, we got it. It says when I heard it, it said apposite. So yeah, apposite. Add. It's highly appropriate, stable, suitable, relevant, or well adapted to a particular circumstances. That's what we got from that. A figure of for our subject here had earlier confronted such facile assumptions by calling them out as forms of foreshortened chillism and what is this word? Millen, Milleranzium. Milleranzium. What the hell is that? Yeah, what is that? Jesus. It's millenarism. They didn't hear you, Joe. The belief of an imminent transformative. What? Oh. Okay, I didn't know. The belief of an imminent transformative and often violent end to the current world order, followed by thousands years sign, reign, and of peace, the millennium, or utopian society. Sorry, we're not bringing up guests. We're reading. Sorry. All right. Brudel understood that 100 years was sometimes too short a period to encompass historical process. Trotsky was assumed by the suggestion that human activity might end or begin with the endings and beginnings of the century. The point is that the construction of period of time is only a catchment for events. Their limited utility, though, is often abused when we turn from the ordering of things, that the chronological sequencing of the order of things that is, the arrangement of their significance, meanings, and relations. Increments of time contoured to the abstract measure rarely match the rhythms of human action. It is important to bear this in mind, as we seek to come to terms with Black theorists whose writings and thoughts have appeared primarily in the 20th century. Their era began with the endings of slavery. They were, it might be said, the children of the slaves. The phenomenology of slavery formed and informed them. And in the vortex of its ending, more particularly in the wake of the social forces that compelled new and different situatings of Black people and other destined to serve as labor forces. These theorists discover their shared social and intellectual location. The 20th century was, for the most part, their biographical situation, but merely one site in the zone of their interrogations. Still, in the post-slavery world order, that was their setting. The Black ideologues who were to work in the 12th century could not be other than stranger. This was to be their lot in whatever part of the Black world they were formed. C.L.R. James might have spoken for all of them when he wrote of the end of his school days, quote, "There was no world for which I was fitted least of all, the one I was now to enter," end quote. In Africa, the West Caribbeans, European empires and colonies were either being dramatically reshaped by the dictates of the state and commerce, or spawned at points formerly less accessible to capitalist expansion. In the United States, the Caribbean, again, Black peoples were no longer conveniently lodged in or organized by slave systems. Black people of the New World could no longer be causally pointed by the curious as slaves or at the margins of such systems as free men. And inevitably, their societies of subcultures upon which the intelligentsias drew were steadily becoming less another hard word. This guy likes using hard words. Let's go look up this word. Autoxinous. Thank you for the heart. Autoxinous. That's what we're dealing with. Autoxinous. No, don't do that. Autoxinous. Which means an adjective describing something such as indigenous peoples, species, or geological formations that is native to a formed in a place where it was found. Okay. Good word. The social patterns, the habits of thought, language, and customs that had congealed in the laborers, communities of the Western Hemisphere's slave system, though in many senses, fundamentally conservative, were no longer as impervious to the penetration of Western culture as they had been in their native circumstances. The masses of Black peoples in the New World and in their ancestral homeland was peasants, farmers, peons, agrarian workers, migrant and immigrant workers, domestics, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled industrial laborers, and as labor reserves, now assumed more diverse and diffuse positions in the economic order. Black laborers' new mobility, organization, and adaptability also meant that the subcultures within which it had been historically enveloped were subject more often to the intrusion of material and ideographic elements from the agents of the economically determinative social order. Though it might be correctly argued that much of this penetration was at first incidental, some of it clearly was not. Language that is the languages of consciousness, of rule and the ruling classes, was an instance of the latter. These accretions would have profound effects on the ideologues of the black world. Marx and Engels, if you recall, had once conceived the notion that the bourgeoisie in Western Europe would succeed in transforming the whole of the world's nation into a bourgeois society, loci reduced to social orders of ruling and proletarian classes, as Marx declared in one of his prefaces to the first volume of Capital. Historically, however, capitalist expansion had as its results only the most proximate relations to Marx's projected social division. In those parts of the world where resourceful indigenous ruling classes were encountered by the empire's builders, collisions were inevitable. Not as inevitable were the results. Some native elites were vanquished and destroyed, others not. Some have led formidable anti-imperialist defenses, preserved much of their independent cultures, whittling down foreign influences to the mundane exchanges required by colonial administration. Many, however, and it is within the British Empire that one finds the best example, become part of the apparatus of indirect rule, a system whose rationale could be so concisely put forth by one of its mechanics, the British anthropologist Marjorie Pearham. The basic difficulties in calling out indirect rule is one that will appear in its different aspects: education, land tenure, economic production, law, in all of our Cummings decision. It is, and here I speak especially of Africa, the great gap between the culture of rulers and ruled. The administration reduced to its simplest terms. It means that for the most part, the people, I gotta do a fucking thing. The people do not understand what we want them to do, or if they understand, they do not want to do it. We endeavor to instruct the leaders of the people and the object of our policies in hope that they will, by their natural authority, at once diffuse the instruction and enact the necessary obedience. For a time, the collaboration of native elites was sufficient for the imperialist and colonial authorities. At the peripheries of the world system were formed of coerced labor, had obtained peasantries, existed in proximity to agrarian workers, unskilled workers to semi-skilled workers. Labor reserves were directly and indirectly connected with those absorbed by the political instruments of authority: armies, militias, native police. By the last decades of the 19th century, however, social forces let loose by imperialist invasion, war, occupation, administration, and co-optation were maturing. In the middle tier of these societies rests the native petty bourgeoisie, wedged between the laboring class beneath them and the foreign and native operatives of capital and the officials of state above. Their social origins were complex and intertwined. One of their bases was the, quote, biracial person populations of the former slave societies in the colonies. This, quote, brown stratum was frequently the natural issue of racial systems, where privilege of positions in education was sometimes bestowed by white fathers or mothers. In other instances, it was the result of deliberate political policies. In his massive study, Caste, Class, and Race, Oliver Cox stated the general rule: where whites were mainly sojourning rulers, their numbers were usually relatively small. Ordinarily home is in Europe or America, and they seldom set their roots in the area. Here, there is little hope of developing a significant white population. The white man's principle need not is not is not a home but a satisfied and exploitable people to develop the resources of their country, of the country. This ruling class adopts a policy of cooperation and other things being equal. Sounds like commoner class connected to imperialist. Favor are distributed to the mixed, not saying the rest because they utilize, um, yeah, on the basis on the basis of their apparent degrees of whiteness among people of color. Degrees of color tend to become a determinant of status in the continuous social class gradient with whites at its upper reaches. The lighter in complexion, the greater the economic and social opportunities. Colorism. The more white you are, the more privileges you get. Mhm. Another basis for the petite bourgeoisie was property. Some black people, but certainly with less frequency than occurred with the French colonialists, termed the petit blanc, had translated particular skills, traditional positions, and knowledge into property, including slaves during the slave era. With slavery abolished, some of this black controlled capital was converted into professional skills in succeeding generations. Frequently, however, the native middle classes have been directly formed as functionaries of the state, civil servants, minor or well as middling, and as agents of landed, mercantile, or manufacturing capital, often absentee. And for sure, I feel like they're talking about neocolonialism in a sense. There were other paths leading to the privileges of the strata, some less legitimate or conventional. So even in our situation, there is a indigenous comprador class, intelligentsia, and there's a black intelligentsia or comprador class that needs to be overthrown too. Our colonial administrators, however, the most problematic origins for the native petite bourgeoisie were the mission schools. From the 15th century and before, the missions had all along served as a part of the rationale for European colonialist and imperialist aspirations. Still, the correspondence between the end of missionary work and the goals of imperialism had never been entirely true. For one, the missionaries themselves, in the case of English imperialism, were often recruited from colonized peoples, that is, Scots, Irish, and Welsh. Such soldiers for Christ could be often quite ambivalent about the colonial power, just as troubling were the potential conflicts between faith and imperial interests. During the construction of the slave systems, and afterwards the teaching of the tenets of Christian beliefs had become as one of its presumptions of the fact of the S words and the S words or pagans' need. It was thus axiomatic that the proof of the missionary's success was created of civilized Christians, natives, whose familiarity with European or Euro-American cultures and habit were as intimate as their experience with Christ. This meant, though, that Christian missionaries, in some instances, felt some ambivalence towards such colonial policies as indirect rule, especially when it was held to involve the strengthening of Nazism or Islam, end quote. As a Victor Murray put it, most significant, however, were the attitudes colonial administrators developed towards the activities of the mission. The construction of black Europeans was overly ambitious in their eyes. In 1938, Arthur Mayhew, who advised the Oxford University summer session for colonial administrators, that, quote, before the Great War, education was undoubtedly too literary. And then he reported with satisfaction that, quote, from 1925 onward, great emphasis was laid on vocational training, end quote. 40 years later, Penelope Hetherington would penetrate Mayhew's objection. In the past, missionaries had counted themselves successful in their work in the field of education, had produced black Englishmen, Africans who seemed to have assimilated Western culture. But these missionaries, educated Africans, were anthems to many administrators and others. They were cheeky and demanded social equality and political rights. It had become necessary to rationalize colonial policy and mission education. The formation of native elites was to be more deliberate, so they were creating native elites. In the beginning, there would be an appropriate contingent of clerks and a limited number of professionals, non-nationalistic intellectuals. In the West, in the Caribbean, such was the educational policy laid down generally at the end of the 19th century. In Africa, where populations were large and missions, schools relatively few, the same policy was inaugurated in the years following World War I. And a commonplace by the 1930s and 1933, the Report of African Affairs read in part. Two especially important objects have been kept in view in framing the educational policy in Nigeria. The first, to spread a sound education was widely as possible among the masses in order to produce, in course of time, the literate population able to participate intelligently in the economic, social, and political development of the country. The second ideal is to train up as soon as many be a body of men and women who can perform some of the task in government work, in private enterprises, for which at the first impact of Western civilization, it is necessary to import Europeans. So they're Europeanizing certain people to make sure that the colonial structure is maintained. They're just like creating this. They're in colonies, but they're creating the neo-colony advancement by creating intelligentsias to colonial domination. Huh? Yeah. As they're talking about Africa and America. So yeah, at it soon became clear, however, that the colonial governments had moved too late. Elite nationalism, quote unquote, one of the first political expressions of the black petty bourgeoisie, was already propelling complements of the class into the older, more profound traditions of radicalism. Elliot Skinner would recall by the 1920s and 1930s, conflict and incoherence had spread into almost all aspects of life in colonial Africa. There appeared a group of Africans who had acquired the cultures of the colonizer and considered themselves to be British, French, and Portuguese. Frantz Fanon talks about this too. They had learned to consider Europe as home and had adopted European clothing, speech, and mannerisms. Such was also the case in the Caribbean and in America, where the emergency of the middle class among black people could easily be traced back to the 18th century. Even in independent Haiti, where black and biracial revolutionary armies had, by the beginning of the 19th century, broke down into racial and class factions. A petit bourgeois nationalism found expression. The sugar export sector of the Haitian economy had been destroyed during the Revolutionary War, and subsequently, as was unable to compete with Cuba, the indigenous exports in the world system. I don't know if that's people from India or actual indigenous people, so I'm just being safe. And though a series of political eruptions from below had divided the land between large landowners, black and biracial, and peasants, the majority of the peasants were landless and frequently rebellious. Commercial pursuits and control of the administration of the state had increasingly become the arenas contended for by the black and biracial groups within the ruling class. But in this conflict, Alex Dupuy asserts, quote, the largely land-owning black factions and its allies, frustrated by the biracial peoples in their attempt to control the state, had recourse to the Nororistia, or black nationalist ideology, claimed to be the sole representatives of the peoples because of their common skin color. End quote. Inevitably, during the second half of the century, the radical black ideology was articulated by renegades among the black petite bourgeoisie intelligentsia. Eventually, it was to mature in the work of Jean Priest Mars, George Sullivan, and Carlos D'Ambrosas Martin. And in every sector of the black world, the dialect of exploitation would shake an increasing number to their very root. And in time, as the fractures and contradictions of Western domination became more compelled with their presence, and their purpose would become electrifyingly clear. Any questions? All right. So it looks like they're like also revolting, but at the same time, the colonial entity is trying to create a comprador class. So, Western civilization and the renegade black intelligentsia. In the Anglophone, Francophone, Latin territories of both hemispheres, the black middle classes had become broadly identified by culture and language. That is, their abilities to absorb the cultures of their ruling classes and reading and speaking of European tongues. Deracinization, is that right? Social and cultural alienation. Huh? All right, cool. Alienation had become the measure of their civility, loyalty, and usefulness. And of course, they shared with the mass of black people, the knowledge that these veneers were the historical artifices of the structuring of authority, caste, race, and class, and that their particular adaptiveness was the mark of privilege and status. The intermediaries between black labor and the world system in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America, the mediators between black workers and the social tapestry woven by capitalist determined forms of production. Their skills were functional, and the neutralness with which they obtained them only apparently so. In the West Indies, Caribbean, sorry, as well as Africa, system of colonial education tutored these complements of imperialism. In North America, in the decades following the Civil War, similar apparatuses were to be found in the southern states of his sector of the African diaspora. James has said, in the West Caribbean islands, in those days from 1900s, for the first 20 and 30 years, there was always a secondary school, always one. In the school I went to, there were 9 masters. 8 of them were either from Oxford or Cambridge, and the one who wasn't was a drawing master. Well, you need not go to Oxford or Cambridge to be a drawing master. Still, for these black middle stratas, just as it was the caste for the vast majority of black people, the dominant class and whites were in general not intimates, right? Intimates of any immediate sort. In the Caribbean and Africa, for the most part, whites were of a relatively small number. In Latin and North America, where European population were statistically dominant, for most black people and whites were existentially, right? A distant fear, an oppressive presence. Whites mark the landscape, and in a way the boundaries of black life. Their lives were habits, their very appearance, the testament and details of a cruel and unyielding order of social and spiritual regulation. For the radical black ideologues, almost entirely circumscribed by native petite bourgeoisie, it was not only inevitable but also imperative that they would first acquire the stance of internal aliens. Those of special interest to us were here bear this out. From Trinidad came George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and Oliver C. Cox. Padmore, born Malcolm Ivan Meredith Nurse, and James were the son of local headmasters. Eric Williams, one of their most illustrious, if prodigal student, was a product of the same black petite bourgeoisie at a somewhat lesser rank. Oliver Cromwell Cox, as his name suggests, was a son of a middle strata parent who it appears had taken the authority of their colonial betters at its word. In North America, W.E.B. Du Bois was reared by the black Beauregard's amidst the more affluent white children of Great Burrington, Massachusetts, as he recalled his childhood in one of his autobiographies, Dark Water. It was some time before his discovery that he was a person of color, and by then he had already absorbed a rather disdainful attitude of his peers towards a few Southern European immigrant families that made their appearance in Great Barrington. Only Richard White, among the radical black thinkers upon whom we shall lay emphasis, came from one black substratum. But even here, the son of a sometimes inerrant Mississippi farmer, a general laborer, was also on his mother's side, and heir of a family with middle strata pretensions. Yeah. Again, with the exception of Wright, they had all begun their adult lives destined for professional careers. Their childhood had borne the marks peculiar to the black middle strata, the presumption that being black was incidental to their accepted social stations. They were launched into maturity, as Wright would declare for himself during one of his moments of acute alienation, as representative of the West. Eventually, this would prove to be the source of their contradictory compulsion, their strengths and their weaknesses. Among the vitalizing tools of the radical intelligentsia, of course, the most crucial was words. Words were their means of placement and signification. Their implements for discovering and revitalization. Yeah, revelation. Yep. New realities for themselves and others. But language, that is Western culture, was more than some recumbent artifact to be used or not as the intelligentsia saw fit. Its place in their lives had been established long before they found the means of mastering it. Indeed, they were themselves in part defined by those languages of rule and commerce. In Frantz Fanon's poetic description, they were black skins under white masks. James was quite effectively captured this contradiction. Amin Sassir and I were talking one day, and I asked him, quote, "Where do you come from?" He said, "Well, I grew up in Martinique, and went to the Victor, Scholasher school." So I said, What did you do there? He told me, Latin and Greek and French literature. And I said, what next? He said, I went to France, and I went to the École Normale Supérieure. I said, yes, I know that school. It is famous for producing scholars and communists. Césaire was one of the first to in each department. He was one of the finest scholars, and he was a notable communist. And I said, quote, what did you do there? And he said, Latin and Greek and French literature. And then I said, where did you go from there? And he said, I went to Sorbonne. And I said, I suppose what you did there, Latin, Greek, and French literature. And he said, exactly. He said, but there is one thing more. And I asked, what is that? And he said, I went back to teach in Martinique. And I went to the Victor Scholasture School. And there I taught Latin, Greek, and French literature. So when Césaire wrote his tremendous attack upon Western civilization and returned to my native land and said that negritude was a statement for some concepts of civilization, which the black people had and which would be important in any development of civilization away from capitalist society. He was able to make this ferocious attack upon Western civilization because he knew it inside out. He had spent some 20 years studying it, as it had been for Césaire. So it was for all of them. They would all pass through the prepossessing claims of bourgeois ideology of Western culture, superiority with their own modestly disgusted racialism. But eventually they would emerge convinced that a larger and different achievement was acquired. At first, they would believe that the answer lay in the vision of class struggle and war between brothers, as Julius Nyerere would later characterize Marxist socialist theory. That exception who would prove to be insufficient. As Cox would write in his own summary, consideration of Marx and Engels were conceptualization of capitalism was only a partial realization of the historical forces that had created the black ideologues, and that they sought to comprehend and defeat. Which is this? Ineluctably? Let me find out. Got it right, ineluctably. And it means, as I take the time, a way that cannot be avoided, escaped, or resisted. We shall see. The events did, the events that did most to shape their era, the crisis of world capitalism, the destructive dialectics of imperialism, and the historical and ideological relevation, revelation. I said it right, and the nativity of Western socialism drove them into a deeper consciousness, appropriately, that Padmore found it necessary to do in the mid 1930s, right in the early 1940s, and James, at the end of that decade, was later echoed by Césaire Declaration in 1956. What I demand of Marxism and communism is that they serve the black peoples, not that the black peoples serve Marxism and communism. Philosophies and movements must serve the people, not the people, the doctrine of the movement. The doctrine is of value only if it is conceived by us and for us and revised through us. We consider it our duty to make common causes with all who cherish truth and justice in order to form organization able to support effectively the black peoples in their present and future struggles, their struggle for justice, for culture, for dignity or liberty. Because of this, please accept my resignation from the party. For such moments of these, each in his own time, turned his face to the historical traditions of black liberation and became black radicals. No, to be honest, C.L.R. James stayed a Marxist, but utilized the black tradition and tried to combine the two, and I think he was successful at that. I'm not too sure because what I'm reading is that's what he did. Such, I'm going to read this from such a moment. Okay, yeah, I did. They began the realization of their history and their theoretical tasks. They shall now consider how this came about and where its several theoretical and ideological significance, signification. Yes, but I'm reading it because it's still a book worth reading. No, I'm not a communizer. We shall proceed historically, adhering to closely as it is possible, to process that encompassed scholarship, practice, and consciousness, and eventually span historiography and the development of the theory of black struggle, as we shall discover the contributions of this intellects who are intellects are enormous, their productivity massive. For these reasons, necessarily, we shall explore only the portion of their work. Hopefully, our review will touch on the more important parts. Much, however, will remain still to be said, understood, and discussed. Theirs is a living legacy, but always we must keep in mind that their brilliance was also derivative. The truer genius was in the midst of the people of whom they wrote. There they struggled was more than words or ideas, but life itself. All right. Any questions? Sure, sure. I don't know completely yet, but they're part of the Marxist they're part of the Marxist thought though. Yeah, but communism has been a historical position. It's not old. It's not new. It's old. You- Who's you all? But these are titles. These are not just titles. These are forms of thoughts and tactics and strategies and how to engage with the objective world. These positions have been a while there. Yes, but there's still a particular position though, just like Maoism is a particular position too. Well, it's facts, it's history, it's objective. I'm sorry. Then why do you call yourself a Maoist then? Yeah, but you still believe in that position though. You identify with it. You, there's no such thing as a Stalinist. There's no such thing as a Stalinist. But each of them engage, and people will pick the correct line. If the correct line is Maoism, then we will respect the people's decision to engage through Maoism, though. Like the People's Protracted Board that's happening all across different nations right now. They're picking the line of Maoism. I know. That's why we are more. I think the thing is having the understanding of these people's position is very key to understanding things better. I think if we deny the understanding of people's position, we deny the person themselves sometimes. Chapter 9: Historiography in the Black Radical Tradition. Communizer is a form of thought that says that dictatorship of the proletariat reinforces capital relations. Maybe. There's communization and there's council commies, I think. They're both of Marxist thought. No, they said that they think the dictatorship proletariat reinforces capital relations. Like I said, we should probably discover this and figure it out. So that way we don't have a distorted thought when it comes to these things. Because people pick those positions because it, like me, I'm a scientific socialist because it makes sense in how I engage with revolution. All right. I still love you though. I hope you still love me. Nice. Yeah. So I wouldn't disregard it yet. Any discussions that attempts to assess the beginnings of radical black historiography and intends to assess the significance of that tradition must take into account two figures, W.E.B. Du Bois and C.L.R. James. Du Bois, being the older, he was born in 1868, will be accorded pride and place. All right, real quick, I have 10 minutes. Let me look. Mm-hmm. Oof. Okay. Because I have to get off on time. Well, I don't have to get off on time. Yeah, that's a long. We're gonna find a stopping point. We're not gonna be able to go all the way through, but we'll find a stopping point. You want to help me with that for 10 minutes? Let's read. Let's read. 'Cause yeah, let's read. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was one of the finest historians ever developed in the United States. The writings of history, though, was but one. What? But yes, maybe people are treating them, but they're still relevant positions. These writings, because we don't blame the people, that's why we don't great man, because these are tools. They're tools that are objectively true. That's why we don't great man people like Stalin and stuff and everything. I don't know. Maybe we should. Maybe we should stop here. 279. We'll stop here. I think you got to separate the people that take these up and the actual philosophy and materialist positions that they take. You got to separate that because people can misrepresent something and then you can talk to someone else that's a left com and they're freaking cool people you know that are willing to have discussions with you and have ideological things. I don't think they're sticking in their. I don't think all of them are sticking in their box. I think you just have that experience from other people that you witnessed. How many left comms do you know of? Three. How many people are in the world? Ah, it's not a small category. There's more people than you think that take up that position, my friend. Promise. You don't know that. You don't know other left comms. Could be. That's like saying that. That's like saying the same thing for Maoists. People that take up the position of Maoism. Yes, but the Maoist formation that we're part of, do you see them great manning anybody? Ah, Ah, so it's not an absoluteness, is it? Well, on here compared to out, not on here, it's not an absolute because there's egregious Maoists too. Would you agree? Because you just said so. But then you said there's also good Maoist people. Yeah. And there are people like the group I'm part of, that's a Marxist Leninist group, is doing that. That's why it's not an absolute. It's fine to ask. Why is that bad to ask if I am or not? I don't feel like I was like that. I think they asked a good question because they never came back and say, well, you suck or you're idealist. They just asked the question. That's how I took it. Well, I took it a different way than you did. I'm sorry. My perception of it was different than yours, I guess. What did you like about this reading? Also, it's also like these people that we look up to did portray their status in that society by engaging in revolutionary thoughts, like C.L.R. James, all those people like Eric White, Eric Williams. Eric Williams came out with a book we're probably going to read called Capitalism and Slavery. So I'm probably going to read that book after that because that keeps getting reminded of things, you know? So probably gonna read that next. I also like the fact that I understand that like when they started teaching black people within these situations, they were developing a comprador class. They were going to advance into a neo-colonialism. That's what like independence, national independence can lead either to the neo-colonial structures or it can lead to scientific socialism. That's the two dialectical positions that national liberation can take up. So what they did is they started creating an intelligentsia to be able to facilitate um, the imperialist interests too. And then you have the other dialectics. You have like Sailor James that were like no, and Fanon that went against that and betrayed the white masks, if I may say. What's up, Dooley? I agree. Yeah. What's up, Dooley?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't here for long, but I do want to mention how I like how it was mentioned that uh, theory should only matter when it serves the actual liberation of people.
Mm-hmm.
I did
Lennon
like that
talked.
part.
Yeah, Marxists have talked about it that like we got to develop proletarian science and proletarian revolution. Like theory is supposed to help the masses to utilize it practically and to make changes according to their conditions, for sure. You're right. It serves theory serves the masses. Dialectical materialism, in my position, should serve the masses always, because the masses are the ones that create and make the conditions and drive towards social revolution. Because me, you, Dooley, Joe, we can't go by ourselves and start a revolution. It requires mass action. So yeah, agree. Anything else?
Uh, no, not really. Thank you for letting me.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. Joe, anything else? You sure? All right. Well, um, I have one person in there, but I don't know. I need to get going because I need to get ready for the call I'm about to make. I'm about to be in. So, yay! So, well, all right. And if you guys have nothing else to say, I will go.